In this section, we will explain how to render the models we have created in ZBrush. Rendering in ZBrush is quite convenient. It can quickly achieve some of the effects we need. Next, let's take a detailed look at what knowledge do we need to understand for rendering in ZBrush. So first, our render button is this BPR render. Its shortcut key is Shift-R. Under the BPR render button, it has a value for anti-aliasing. The maximum value is 7. The minimum value is 0. So the default setting is 3. So when we are rendering initially and checking the effect, we can turn off the anti-aliasing and set it to 0. In this way, we can quickly and conveniently see the approximate effect of our rendering. Then we can set the anti-aliasing value back to 7. The size of our rendering is adjusted through the document. Canvas size. Since our character is standing vertically, so I will adjust its value to a vertical rectangle shape here. Can be made even smaller. After adjusting this value, press the chop key, and our canvas will be reset to vertical. At this point, we press Ctrl-N to create a new canvas, and we can reposition our character. In this scene, press T to enter edit mode. Here, counting from the bottom, the third key, zoom key, we can adjust the canvas to be slightly smaller so that it can fit within our view completely. Next, let's adjust the angle we need to render from. This should be about right. Next, for our character, what you need to render out and what its material looks like. It's relatively simple. We simply, in our material, select the material we desire and directly perform a BPR render. Another approach is to select several material spheres, such as the skin shader or some with different lighting properties. So by rendering with these multiple material spheres, and finally compositing in Photoshop, we can achieve the effect we need. This is also possible. In this tutorial, we mainly use the latter method to render several material spheres simultaneously, and then composite them in Photoshop to achieve a relatively ideal effect. It's worth mentioning that in ZBrush's material spheres, they are divided into two parts: matcap and standard. What is the difference between these two sets of material spheres? In the first set, these material spheres on top are not affected by our light source. In other words, if you add a light in ZBrush, no matter how you position the light, the lighting information of these material spheres still there. It won't be affected by the light you cast. Changed. If you want to render a model with light source information, then I suggest you use this standard material ball. In the lower section, of course, we can also simultaneously use both of these material spheres for rendering. Finally, composite in Photoshop to achieve the effect we need. Next, what we need to understand is, in VPR rendering, it can simultaneously output many channels. I will briefly explain here. After rendering, you can see, in this window, we can see several channels inside. The first one is shader, which is the image we are currently seeing, the image we have rendered. The second one is depth. This is our depth of field. The third one is shadow. The fourth one is occlusion. Of course, we haven't selected occlusion yet, so it hasn't been rendered. And finally, a mask. All of these are automatically generated after you finish rendering. So these images are very useful when we composite. During the composite process, you will understand the specific purpose of each of these images. Another point that needs to be explained is DPR shadow. DPR shadow, in other words, what you see after our character has been rendered. the shadow it produces on the model. This shadow. We can adjust its blur level. This blur value here adjusts its blur level. And we can also adjust this ray, which refers to the light we project, how many there are. We can also adjust the angle of the shadow, referring to this angle value. The specific values are something you will need to continuously experiment with and adjust during the rendering process in order to achieve the desired effect. Of course, BPR rendering also provides rendering options such as AO and 3's material rendering. If you need to output AO and 3's images during rendering, you can enable these options in the rendering settings, and they will be included in the output after rendering. You can then individually save each image. After understanding this, you will also need to understand the principles of lighting. In ZBrush, there is a separate menu called Light. When you select these materials, you can adjust the light angle here. ZB also provides preset light properties and parameters only when the light is activated and appears orange. Will the light be active if I turn it off? The entire scene will be without light. This is something you must pay attention to. Finally, before rendering, we need to do one more thing, which is to assign a different vertex color to each part of the object. I have already mostly assigned these colors, similar to an ID mask. With this ID mask, we can easily select each part of the object in post-production software. After completing these preparations, we can begin the actual rendering process. First, we need to render the ID mask. When rendering the ID mask, we need to set the material to flat color. At this point, you will see that our character is displayed without lighting. At this stage, we don't need the vertex colors for the face. After completing these preparations, we need to understand some principles of lighting. In ZBrush, there is a separate menu called Light. When we render the ID mask, we need to set the material to flat color. So everyone can see it here. Our character is displayed without lighting. At this point, we don't need these vertex colors on its face, including the vertex color on this board. Remove it. At this point, we can turn on occlusion, turn on shadow. We don't need 3's. So turn off 3's. Set the sampling value to 7. Okay, let's render directly. When the sampling value is set to 7, you can see that the rendering speed is not very fast. Everyone needs to wait patiently. At this point, we have finished rendering. In this dialog box generated by the rendering, we can see that at this point we already have the 5 images we need. They are the ID mask, depth map, and then shadow, and AO, as well as a mask for our entire character. We export them separately. Just click on these small images. In order to better manage the files, we need to give each image a very good name. For example, this one is the Vade mask. We save these files in the format, which can be directly in PSD format. Then save the depth. Good. After completing this step, we can turn off shadow and occlusion, because they are not needed in the subsequent rendering. To save time, these two do not need to be rendered again. Then what we need to do is turn off all the vertex colors of each fixture and render the textures we previously painted on the board, including the vertex colors on the body, the vertex colors of the eyes, eyebrows, and eyelashes to render them once. Simply press BPR. Forgot to turn off the hair. Okay, let's do it again. then here everyone can see that shadow and occlusion will not be generated again. So what we need is the information of these vertex colors. So we just need to save this one image separately. So at this point, we have completed the first step. We have already rendered some basic channels, and then the shadows, and the depth of field. Next, we need to render some materials. You can download many ZBrush materials online. These materials already have some inherent lighting properties in them. At this point, what we need it to present is what kind of lighting effect. For example, whether it is a top light, or if it is a front light, or its overall feeling. I want it to be somewhat metallic, or leaning towards a muddy feeling, more of a clay or mud feeling. This is something everyone can decide for themselves. So at this point, I think there are some that are quite good, like this one. For example, this material, in the structure of the object, it will have a reddish light, which is exactly what I want. On the surface structure of the skin, some of those small highlights, we can use this material. So we can directly render with BPR here. Forgot one thing, when doing this rendering, we don't need to turn on the vertex color again, because we have already rendered the vertex color separately. So all of that can be turned off directly. Then let's render again. Click on the first image. We output the rendering of the first material. Good. Next, let's render this material ball. Send it out. The default skin shader provided by the system is also very good. Now we have rendered images of 3 material balls. So later we can try what this effect actually looks like. Next, we need to add some light to this character. On its side, or on its back, add 2 rim lights to make its side structure more prominent and look better. So at this point we need to use the row of materials below. When adjusting the rim light, you can go to the light panel and turn on a light. Then turn off the main light. As for the rim light, I suggest you can adjust it to be a bit brighter. Right-click on the direction point of this light source, and then aim the light towards the back. We can use this method to adjust a very prominent rim light that highlights its figure. I suggest you can adjust the light slightly to the side to have a bright edge. That's it. If you want a stage effect, I suggest you can add some color to this rim light. For example, I chose a very bright and very pure blue-green rim light. Let's render it and see the effect. This is basically the effect we want. Next, let's turn up the anti-aliasing to the maximum and render it again. Okay, let's send out this image. We haven't finished rendering this rim light yet. Next, we need to turn on its shadow. Let's continue to render it. After this rendering, we can export a separate shadow channel to facilitate our adjustments in post-production. If you feel that one rim light is not enough, you can add another one and give it a different color. Let's render another one. Since this one has the shadow turned on, we just need to save out the shadow. Next, let's turn off the shadow. And then save out this one. Next, we need to go to Photoshop to composite the images we just rendered, to complete our final rendering effect. Good. Next, let's go to Photoshop to do the final composition for this rendering. So first, let's open the texture and vertex color we rendered earlier. The first step is to first take the channels we just rendered and apply them to this image. These include AO, our depth of field, our ID mask, and our shadow. Just drag this image into that one, and it will automatically generate a corresponding alpha in the channels. Let's name this alpha. When we got this depth of field image, it is a 16-bit grayscale image, which doesn't match our RGB 8-bit image. So here we can simply Control-A, Control-C. Then in our channels create a new alpha, and paste it in with Control-V. Then move the occlusion over as well. I remember there's also a mask. Let's switch to the RGB channel and move this ID mask over as well. In this way, we already have we have the 4 channels we need, and we have this ID mask image. Next, what we'll do is, we'll directly select in the channel by pressing Ctrl. Its overall mask. On the color, create a mask, and extract this color separately. Next, we'll continue. Remember, we rendered 3 texture images before. We'll also import these 3 texture images separately. So mainly, we'll focus on this M3. First, drag M3 over, and then use the multiply blending mode. In this way, we can directly obtain a vertex color and a character with texture. Next, we'll take this M2 and import it. Similarly, apply a mask and name it. We can use some overlay properties for this to see what the effect looks like. Generally, our overlay effects are usually in overlay or soft light. For hard light, you can see, after adding this texture, the whole object will appear more stable and have more weight, so you can also see, it comes with an orange attribute. We can adjust the hue a bit, including its purity, to intervene in this color, to see if it needs to be biased. What kind of effect? Next, we can then bring in this one as well. And apply the same mask. And see again, if there are some better looking effects. After adding this, you can see, near the highlights, it will have a reddish color, which looks quite nice. You can also use many other types of texture rendering, and overlay them with Photoshop to find a suitable effect like this. Next, we'll then specifically adjust each material. For the second material, I want it to only affect the skin, and have an impact on the areas with skin, but not on its clothing, or things like hair and shoes. So we'll use this ID mask to select the areas with skin, and then invert the selection. In the mask of layer M2, fill it with black. In this way, You can see that this material of ours only has an impact on the skin and is not affecting other areas. Next, we can also specifically adjust its layer transparency and see the extent of its impact. Whether it needs this much, it seems to be fine for now. It should be quite good. Good. Next, let's take a look at layer M1. The overlay may be a bit excessive. Next, let's change it to soft light, and then adjust the transparency appropriately. We can toggle these layers multiple times and their display properties to see the effect, whether it is what we need. We can see that this layer will enhance the sense of volume. At this point, we can use the performance of this material to enhance the volume of these objects, other than the skin. So at this point, we need to use the ID mask again. After we've duplicated an M1 material, we need to remove this part of the skin. Then enhance the volume of the clothing, while the skin part does not need to be emphasized. So at this point, how do we operate this mask? First, press Ctrl. Load the original mask. Then in the ID layer, we choose the magic wand tool. Hold down Out to remove the skin part. Okay. Turn off the ID layer. Then next, delete the original mask. Rebuild a new mask. In this way, we will have a mask layer with only clothing and hair. So such a mask layer. So in this case, we repeatedly emphasized the volume of all objects except the skin. This way it can be more convenient for us to represent some slight differences in the material of the model. Next, we need to add occlusion and shadow. In the channels we just had, we have already imported both occlusion and shadow. So what do we do next? Select the shadow layer by pressing Ctrl. Then directly adjust the hue and saturation here. At this point, we found that our mask is actually inverted. It should actually affect the black parts. So at this point, we need to invert the mask. Then go back to the display of the layers. Here in the shadow, because the shadow, we can adjust the lightness. That is, lower the brightness a bit. You can see, after the brightness is darkened, the shadow gradually becomes visible. Of course, if you feel that the shadow needs to have a color, then that's also not a problem. We can use the colorize option to add some color to the shadow. The advantage of doing this is that it can make the shadow more transparent. Okay. Next, we will use the same method again. We select AO, and then add hue and saturation. Remember to invert the mask for the AO. Adjust the AO. If you need some color bias, you can adjust the color bias. Check the colorize option. We can use the display properties toggle to see the effect after adding the shadow and AO. After there are basically no issues, next we still need to do the final step, which is to bring in the two lightings we just had. Again, the lighting, because our shadow and the final rendering are rendered separately. So here we can separately import the shadow into this image. Create a new layer.
Ctrl A, Ctrl C, Ctrl F.
Then using the multiply blending mode, you can see that after adding the shadow, this image of the light source information has masked out all the unnecessary information using the shadow. So we can use this image by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E to merge all. Then import it into our final rendering image. I forgot to name these two layers earlier. Remember to name them. So for the light source information, we will use the Lighten blending mode to blend it in. After adding Lighten, you can see that one lighting has been applied to this character. And it's very well integrated into the entire rendering. So next, let's do another light metering and process it as well.
CTRL-A, CTRL-C, CTRL-E.
Merge the exposures. In this way, we have completed the composition of this image. The final step. If you feel that your rendering is already fine, we can merge everything. Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E. We also need to use the depth channel to add some depth of field to this character. We select the layer that we just merged. Then in the filters, choose Blur, Lens Blur. After opening this filter, select Depth as the source here, which is the depth of field image. After having this image, you can see it can actually adjust the depth very significantly. For example, if I need to focus on the chest, or if I need to focus on the face, then how much should the blurring be? I think if it's too much, it can be further reduced. I think it's okay. Just okay is fine. In this way, we have basically completed the composition of this image. This is the entire ZBrush rendering output, and the entire process of composition in Photoshop. I hope this part can be helpful to everyone. Next, I can show you some images that I rendered previously, using the same method. You can keep this PS file in the end, and rotate to other angles in ZB, and use the same method to composite images from other angles. This way will be very convenient and efficient. These are all images I rendered using basically the same method. But if you have enough time, you can render the images in high resolution, which will have a strong visual impact. Okay, this part of the tutorial ends here.